The roar of private jets echoed across the sunlit Los Angeles sky as Anthony Walker stepped out of his sleek black BMW. The valet's eyes widened momentarily, taking in the tall, broad-shouldered black man dressed sharply in dark jeans, a tailored grey blazer, and pristine white sneakers. Anthony handed over the keys with a polite nod, his calm confidence exuding an air of quiet authority. As he stepped into the private terminal, the luxury was undeniable. Marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of ambient lighting. Wealthy passengers lounged in plush leather chairs, sipping champagne, and impeccably dressed staff moved with practiced precision. Anthony walked in with purpose, a carry-on slung casually over one shoulder. He glanced briefly at the gilded clock on the wall. He had exactly 1 hour before his flight to New York for a high-stakes business meeting. Approaching a reception desk, Anthony greeted the attendant with a warm yet professional smile. The young woman, her blonde hair styled to perfection, barely looked up from her computer. Her eyes flicked his attire and lingered a moment too long before she finally spoke. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone neutral but laced with a subtle hint of dismissal. "I'm here for the Ascendero jet," Anthony replied evenly. The attendant hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as if unsure whether to proceed. "Name?" she asked, her voice betraying a flicker of doubt. "Anthony Walker," he said calmly. Her fingers stilled briefly, and for a split second her expression faltered. But she quickly masked it with a practiced smile. "1 moment, please." Anthony stepped aside, his sharp eyes scanning the terminal. He was no stranger to moments like these, those fleeting but unmistakable judgments that others made when they saw him. Even after years of success, the weight of those assumptions lingered in the air, subtle but ever-present. From across the room, Megan Harding emerged, clipboard in hand. Her tailored uniform and perfectly styled brunette hair screamed authority. Spotting Anthony, she strode toward him, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Her posture was confident, her tone clipped and efficient as she addressed him. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her words laced with an edge. "Are you lost? This area is for private jet passengers only." Anthony turned to face her, his expression calm but firm. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," he said. Megan's eyes narrowed slightly as they swept over him, assessing every detail. Her lips curved into a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And you are?" "Anthony Walker," he said again, his voice steady. "I'm here to board my jet." Her brows lifted in disbelief, and she glanced back at the receptionist, who only shrugged helplessly. Turning her attention back to Anthony, Megan's smile tightened further. "Let me check on that for you," she said, her words dripping with condescension. "Please wait here." Anthony stood silently, irritation simmering beneath his composed exterior. He had spent years perfecting the art of maintaining his poise, but moments like these still grated on him. Megan walked to the corner of the reception desk and whispered hurriedly to the attendant. Though her voice was low, it wasn't quiet enough to mask her words entirely. "Are you sure he's not mistaken?" Megan asked. "This happens all the time." The attendant murmured a response, but Megan shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. She turned back to Anthony, her expression now carefully neutral. "I'm sorry, Mr. Walker," she said, though there was no real apology in her tone. "I can't allow you to board without proper verification. Security measures, you understand." Anthony met her gaze, his dark eyes steady. "My name is on the flight manifest," he said firmly. "Perhaps you should check it again." "Of course," Megan replied briskly. "But in the meantime, I must ask you to step aside so we can process our other passengers." As if on cue, a group of well-dressed individuals entered the terminal. Megan's demeanor shifted instantly. Her smile became bright and welcoming, her voice lilting with practiced charm. "Mr. Edwards, welcome back. Let me escort you to the lounge," she said, completely ignoring Anthony. Watching her usher the group past him, Anthony felt his jaw tighten. He glanced at his watch minus 45 minutes until takeoff. Time for patience was running out. Pulling out his phone, he dialed his assistant, Sophia. Her voice came through immediately, calm and efficient as always. "What's wrong?" she asked. "I'm being delayed," Anthony said. "Can you get the terminal manager on the line? I need this resolved." "Give me 2 minutes," Sophia replied. True to her word, the terminal manager, a middle-aged man with a harried expression, approached Anthony moments later. Megan trailed behind him, her face a mask of professional indignation. "Mr. Walker, I'm so sorry for the confusion," the manager said, his tone full of deference. "I assure you we'll have you boarded right away." Megan's eyes darted between Anthony and the manager, realization dawning too late. "He's the owner," she whispered harshly. The manager gave her a sharp look before turning back to Anthony. "Please accept our apologies," he said. "We'll handle everything from here." Anthony's voice was calm but carried an undeniable weight. "Not so fast." He stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Megan. The terminal fell silent as passengers and staff turned to watch the unfolding scene. "You dismissed me without verifying who I was," Anthony said, his tone cutting through the tension. "You assumed I didn't belong here and treated me with less respect than anyone else in this room. Why?" Megan's face flushed. "I was following protocol." "Protocol?" Anthony repeated, his voice edged with disbelief or prejudice. She opened her mouth to respond, but he raised a hand to stop her. "I built this company so no one could make me feel small," he said, his voice steady. "And I won't tolerate it from someone I'm paying." The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Anthony turned to the terminal manager. "Fire her and the rest of her crew immediately," he said. And just like that, the balance of power shifted. But this was only the beginning. What happened next would not only spark a media frenzy, but also ignite a much larger conversation about prejudice, power, and the change that comes when someone refuses to be silent. As the terminal manager scrambled to diffuse the tension, Megan's face went pale, her carefully crafted composure cracking. Around them, the hum of murmured conversations filled the room. Passengers whispered among themselves, some glancing at Anthony, others at Megan, their expressions a mix of curiosity and judgment. Anthony remained steady, his calm demeanor masking the frustration and wariness that moments like these brought. He had faced prejudice before, but this time it cut deeper. It was happening in a space he had created, a company he had built from the ground up. The manager, now visibly flustered, gestured toward a nearby lounge. "Mr. Walker, please allow me to personally escort you to a more private area while we sort this out." Anthony's gaze lingered on Megan for a beat longer. "Make sure it's sorted quickly," he said, his voice firm, but controlled. Then, without another glance, he followed the manager into the lounge, leaving the staff and passengers in stunned silence. Inside the lounge, the atmosphere was markedly different. The soft hum of jazz music played in the background, and the air smelled faintly of leather and fresh flowers. Anthony settled into one of the plush chairs, his mind racing. His phone buzzed on the table, and he saw a message from Sophia. Asterisk, "Do you want me to escalate this further? I've got media contacts on standby asterisk." Anthony hesitated, his fingers hovering over the screen. He wasn't one to jump to public spectacle, but there was something undeniably unjust about what had just happened. He tapped out a quick reply. Asterisk, not yet. Let's see how they handle this internally, asterisk. As he waited, his thoughts drifted back to the beginning. Ascend Arrow wasn't just another private aviation company. It was the realization of a dream that had started decades ago. Growing up in a small town in Georgia, Anthony had watched his parents struggle against systemic barriers. His father, a mechanic, often worked long hours repairing cars, but was never given a chance to advance, no matter how skilled he was. His mother, a school teacher, had taught him the value of perseverance and education, but often reminded him of the harsh reality. For a black man in America, success came with an asterisk. Anthony had carried those lessons with him through college, where he studied business and engineering, and later into the corporate world, where he climbed the ranks despite the unspoken obstacles. But it wasn't enough to succeed for himself. He wanted to create something that defied expectations, something that would challenge the very biases he had spent his life overcoming. That's how Ascend Aero was born. A private aviation company that prided itself on inclusivity and excellence, where the only thing that mattered was capability and character. But moments like these reminded him how far there was still to go. The lounge door opened, breaking his train of thought. The terminal manager walked in, looking more composed now, but still visibly nervous. "Mr. Walker, again, I want to extend our deepest apologies for the misunderstanding." Anthony leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Is it handled?" he asked, his tone neutral. "Yes, sir. Megan and her team have been relieved of their duties, effective immediately," the manager said. "We're also conducting a review of our policies to ensure this doesn't happen again." Anthony studied the man's face for a moment. "Good. But I want a detailed report on my desk by the end of the day," he said. "This isn't just about firing a few people. It's about making sure this culture doesn't exist here at all." The manager nodded quickly. "Understood, sir. I'll personally oversee the review." With that, the manager left, leaving Anthony alone with his thoughts once again. The tension in his chest hadn't eased. He knew that dismissing the staff involved was a necessary step, but it didn't address the larger issue. Prejudice wasn't something you could fire away. It required systemic change, and change took time. Outside the lounge, whispers about the incident were spreading like wildfire. Passengers speculated about what had happened, piecing together bits of overheard conversations and their own assumptions. Some expressed shock that Anthony was the owner of the company, while others questioned how such an oversight could occur in the first place. Among them was a middle-aged woman in a crisp navy suit, her sharp eyes narrowing as she listened to the chatter. Her name was Carla Bennett, an investigative journalist who had been flying to New York for a different story entirely. But now, her instincts told her there was more to this situation than met the eye. Carla pulled out her phone and began taking notes, her curiosity piqued. She had covered stories of corporate misconduct and racial bias before, but there was something compelling about the way Anthony had handled the confrontation. It wasn't just about him being denied access to his own jet. It was about the bigger questions his experience raised, questions she intended to answer. Meanwhile, back in the lounge, Anthony's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from Sophia. "I've been monitoring social media," she said without preamble. "A few passengers have already posted about what happened. It's gaining traction." Anthony pinched the bridge of his nose. "How bad is it?" "It's mixed," Sophia replied. "Some people are defending you, saying this is exactly why systemic bias needs to be addressed. Others are questioning why you fired the crew so quickly without investigating further." Anthony exhaled slowly. "Draft a statement," he said. "Keep it focused on the facts and the broader issues. This isn't about me. It's about the principle." "Understood," Sophia said. "I'll have something ready in the next hour." As he ended the call, Anthony felt the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. He had spent years trying to build something that stood for progress, and yet, moments like this reminded him how fragile that progress could be. But giving up wasn't an option. If anything, this was a chance to push the conversation forward, to turn a personal slight into a catalyst for change. Across the terminal, Carla was already digging deeper. She approached the receptionist who had initially interacted with Anthony, her press credentials in hand. "Excuse me," Carla said, her tone friendly but firm. "I'm writing a piece on private aviation, and I couldn't help but notice the commotion earlier. Care to comment?" The receptionist hesitated, glancing around nervously. "I really shouldn't," she said. "It's been a chaotic day." "I understand," Carla said with a sympathetic smile. "But stories like this matter. They can make a real difference." The receptionist hesitated again, but eventually nodded. "Off the record, I wasn't surprised by what happened," she said in a low voice. "Megan's had complaints before, but nothing ever came of it." Carla's pen flew across her notebook. "Complaints about what?" "About how she treats people," the receptionist said, glancing over her shoulder. "Especially people she doesn't think belong here." As Carla thanked her and walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that this story was going to be bigger than she had anticipated. Back in the lounge, Anthony stared out the window at his jet, its sleek frame gleaming in the sunlight. He thought about his parents, about the sacrifices they had made to give him a chance at success. He thought about the people who looked up to him, who saw him as proof that breaking barriers was possible. And he thought about the passengers and staff who had witnessed what happened today, the unspoken lessons they would take away from it. As Anthony sat in the lounge, his mind turned to the broader implications of what had unfolded. It wasn't just about him or the humiliation he had endured. This moment represented something much larger, an insidious problem that countless others faced every day, often without the means or power to challenge it. Anthony wasn't just a CEO who had been underestimated. He was a symbol, willingly or not, of the challenges black men and women faced even at the pinnacle of success. Sophia's call had left him uneasy. The social media buzz around the incident was both a blessing and a potential minefield. He knew that public opinion was fickle. While some would rally behind the principles of fairness and equality, others would see his actions as impulsive or driven by emotion. There would be those who twisted the narrative to fit their own biases, and that made every decision he took now all the more critical. Meanwhile, Carla Bennett had positioned herself in a quiet corner of the terminal. Her journalist's instincts told her there was more to this story than the public humiliation of the powerful man. She began digging into Ascendaro's history, scouring the internet for any hint of controversy. To her surprise, she found very little. Anthony Walker had built a reputation not just as a savvy businessman, but as someone who actively worked to promote diversity in his industry. He had funded scholarships, advocated for equitable hiring practices, and even hosted annual leadership summits focused on dismantling systemic bias. Carla frowned at her screen. If Anthony's track record was so clean, how had this situation arisen under his watch? Was it a single lapse in judgment by a few rogue employees? Or was there something deeper at play? She began drafting a list of questions, her curiosity growing with every passing moment. Inside the lounge, Anthony's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from his legal team, warning him to tread carefully. While he had every right to dismiss employees who acted inappropriately, they cautioned that publicizing their names or making sweeping statements could open him up to legal challenges. Anthony sighed, his frustration mounting. It was a delicate balance, demanding accountability without inadvertently creating a new problem. Across the terminal, Megan Harding sat in a quiet conference room, her hands trembling as she stared at her phone. The news of her dismissal had already reached her family, and the messages ranged from concern to anger. She wasn't ready to admit it aloud, but deep down, she knew Anthony's accusations weren't baseless. She had made a snap judgment about him the moment he walked through the terminal doors, and now that decision had cost her everything. But Megan wasn't the only one grappling with the fallout. In the employee break room, the rest of her former crew exchanged uneasy glances. Some felt relief that they wouldn't be caught in the crossfire, while others worried about what their termination meant for their own futures. One of them, a young woman named Elena, couldn't shake the feeling that they had been complicit in something bigger than they realized. Elena hesitated before speaking up. "Do you think he'll press charges?" she asked quietly, her voice breaking the heavy silence. A man sitting across from her shrugged. "He could, but I don't think that's his style," he said. "From what I've read about him, he's more about making a statement than dragging things through the courts." Elena bit her lip. "Still, it doesn't feel right. Maybe if we'd said something earlier." Her words hung in the air, unspoken guilt settling over the group. Back in the lounge, Anthony was joined by his head of operations, Marcus Hill. Marcus had flown in from Los Angeles the moment he heard about the incident, determined to stand by his boss and friend. As a black man who had also faced his share of prejudice in corporate America, Marcus knew all too well the sting of moments like these. "Anthony," Marcus began, his voice low, "you know I've got your back no matter what, but we need to think carefully about our next steps. This isn't just about firing a few people. It's about setting a precedent." Anthony nodded slowly. "I know, but how do we strike the right balance? If we let this slide, it sends the wrong message. If we come down too hard, it could backfire. Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. We focus on the message, not the individuals. This isn't just about Megan Harding or her crew. It's about what they represent. We use this moment to push for real change, not just in our company, but across the industry. Anthony considered Marcus's words. He knew his friend was right. The actions he took now would reverberate far beyond the walls of Ascendaro. They had the potential to spark conversations in boardrooms and break rooms alike, forcing people to confront the biases they often ignored. At the same time, Carla was approaching her own breakthrough. After a series of discreet interviews with current and former Ascendaro employees, she began piecing together a pattern. While Anthony's leadership was widely respected, there were pockets within the company, particularly in the operational and customer-facing teams, where old prejudices still lingered. Employees spoke of subtle microaggressions, coded language, and an unspoken hierarchy that often left people of color feeling marginalized. Carla's heart raced as she realized the scope of her story. This wasn't just about one man being denied access to his own jet. It was about how even the most progressive organizations could fall short when systemic bias was allowed to fester. She knew she was onto something big, but she also understood the responsibility that came with telling this story. It wasn't just about exposing a problem. It was about pushing for solutions. As Anthony prepared to board his jet, the weight of the day pressed heavily on him. The situation had escalated far beyond what he had anticipated, and he knew that resolving it would require more than a carefully worded statement or a public apology. It would require a commitment to action, a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths and demand better from everyone involved, including himself. As the jet's engines roared to life and the aircraft began its ascent, Anthony gazed out the window, his thoughts turning to the road ahead. He had built Ascendaro to be a symbol of progress, but symbols were meaningless without substance. Now more than ever, he was determined to ensure that his company lived up to the ideals it claimed to represent. The tension in the air remained palpable, unresolved, and brimming with possibilities. Anthony didn't yet know how the story would end, but one thing was certain: it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the jet glided through the clouds, Anthony reclined in his seat, staring blankly at the sleek leather interior. His mind wasn't on the luxury surrounding him or the skyline below. It was on the storm brewing beneath the surface. The weight of everything that had unfolded was pressing down on him, and he could feel the tension mounting. This wasn't just a personal ordeal anymore. It was a pivotal moment for his company and his reputation. He needed to get it right, but the stakes were high, and the margin for error was razor-thin. Sophia's updates buzzed on his phone in rapid succession. News outlets had picked up the story, each spinning it in their own way. Some focused on the systemic issues the incident highlighted, while others took a more critical stance, questioning Anthony's swift dismissal of Megan and her team. Anthony scrolled through the headlines, his jaw tightening with every speculative comment. He knew he had to act decisively, but the scrutiny was relentless. Every move he made would be dissected, and any misstep could derail the message he wanted to convey. At the same time, Megan sat in her apartment, scrolling through the same articles. The reality of her actions was sinking in, and she couldn't shake the memory of Anthony's calm but piercing words. She had dismissed him without hesitation, her assumptions driving every decision she made that day. Now, as she read the flood of responses from people sharing their own stories of discrimination, she realized just how deep her mistake had gone. But Megan wasn't ready to accept full responsibility, not yet. Instead, she clung to the idea that her actions were simply a product of company policy, not personal bias. Carla, the journalist, was piecing together the final threads of her article. She had spent hours digging deeper into Ascendaro's internal culture, speaking to employees at various levels of the organization. What she uncovered was trembling. While Anthony had worked tirelessly to champion diversity and inclusion, it was clear that certain teams hadn't embraced those values as fully as he had hoped. Carla's article was shaping up to be a balanced yet hard-hitting piece that would challenge Ascendaro to live up to its own ideals. But she knew the timing of its release would be critical. Dropping the story too soon could fan the flames of controversy, while waiting too long might dull its impact. On the jet, Marcus joined Anthony in the cabin, holding a tablet loaded with reports from their PR and legal teams. "We need a plan," Marcus said, his tone urgent but measured. "The public's watching, and the employees are on edge. If we don't take control of the narrative, someone else will." Anthony nodded but didn't look up. "I've been thinking about it," he said quietly. "This isn't just about damage control, Marcus. It's about making real change. If we sweep this under the rug or let it fade away, we're no better than the people we're trying to hold accountable." Marcus leaned forward, sensing the determination in Anthony's voice. "What do you have in mind?" Anthony finally met Marcus's gaze, his eyes sharp and resolute. "We're going to address this head-on. A company-wide overhaul, starting with mandatory training for every employee, no exceptions. And we're going to bring in outside experts, people who can identify the blind spots we've missed." Marcus nodded, impressed by Anthony's clarity of purpose. But he also knew there was a risk in being so transparent. "You realize this could make us a target, right? Admitting there's a problem might invite even more scrutiny." Anthony's expression didn't waver. "Let them scrutinize. If we're serious about leading by example, we can't be afraid of what people might say. This isn't about protecting an image. It's about doing what's right." Meanwhile, Megan received an unexpected email from Ascend Arrow's HR department. It wasn't a termination notice, as she had feared, but an invitation to meet with the company's internal review panel. The email outlined an opportunity for Megan to share her side of the story and participate in a restorative process aimed at addressing the root causes of what had happened. Megan's initial reaction was defensive, but as she reread the email, a small part of her felt relieved. Perhaps this was her chance to make amends, or at least understand where she had gone wrong. Back at Ascend Arrow's headquarters, a team of executives was grappling with the fallout. The incident had exposed cracks in the company's culture, and they were scrambling to address them. Some executives saw the situation as an opportunity to double down on their commitment to diversity, while others worried about the financial impact of negative press. Tensions ran high as debates broke out in boardrooms, each person trying to balance ethical responsibility with business practicality. Outside the corporate walls, the story continued to gain traction. Social media was flooded with posts from people sharing their own encounters with prejudice, often tagging Ascend Arrow and demanding accountability. Some praised Anthony's swift action, while others criticized the broader culture that had allowed such an incident to occur in the first place. Activist groups began calling for industry-wide reforms, using Ascend Arrow as a case study for why change was urgently needed. As the jet began its descent into New York, Anthony's thoughts turned to the upcoming meeting with a major investor. He knew the incident would come up, and he needed to be prepared. Investors weren't just looking at profit margins anymore. They wanted to know where companies stood on social issues and how they were addressing them. Anthony resolved to be honest about the challenges Ascend Arrow was facing and transparent about the steps they were taking to address them. It was a gamble, but he believed it was the only way to rebuild trust and move forward. The tension was palpable as the plane touched down and taxied to the gate. Anthony's phone buzzed once more, a notification from Sophia. "The investor meeting has been rescheduled for tomorrow," her message read. "But you need to know, there's been another development. Carla Bennett is releasing her article tonight." Anthony exhaled sharply, his mind racing. He wasn't afraid of the truth coming out, but the timing couldn't have been worse. The article would undoubtedly add fuel to the fire, and the public's reaction was unpredictable. He glanced at Marcus, who had also seen the message. Without a word, they both understood what had to be done. They needed to get ahead of the narrative, and fast. As the evening unfolded, the world waited in anticipation. Carla's article, Megan's impending review, and Anthony's next move were all pieces of a puzzle that had yet to take shape. Each decision, each revelation, carried the potential to either resolve the conflict or deepen it further. The tension hung heavy in the air, leaving everyone involved bracing for what was to come. As Anthony sat in the back of his black SUV, the city lights of New York flickering past, His phone buzzed relentlessly. Carla's article had just gone live, and within minutes it was spreading like wildfire across social media and news platforms. The headline alone was enough to send ripples through the industry. Asterisk when success isn't enough. A tale of prejudice and power at 40,000 feet. Asterisk, the expose was unflinchingly honest, diving deep into Anthony's personal experiences, the incident at the terminal, and the systemic issues it exposed within Ascendaro and the wider corporate world. Anthony read the opening lines, his pulse quickening. Carla hadn't held back, but she had also been fair. The article painted a vivid picture of his journey, the struggles he had faced as a black entrepreneur, the barriers he had broken, and the glaring moments of prejudice he still encountered, even at the height of his success. But then came the twist he hadn't anticipated. Carla had uncovered emails from Ascendaro staff that suggested the discriminatory attitudes of the terminal weren't isolated incidents. Some employees had made or found remarks about passengers who didn't look the part, and others had joked about implementing stricter screening for certain demographics. Anthony's stomach tightened as he read. This wasn't just a single event fueled by unconscious bias. It was a symptom of a deeper problem within his company. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, heavier than before. He had built Ascendaro to challenge stereotypes, to create opportunities where none existed for people like him. But somehow, despite his best efforts, the cracks have formed, and now they were visible to the world. Marcus, sitting across from him, glanced at his own phone, his expression grim. "We have a bigger issue," he said, his voice low. "The emails Carla mentioned, they're already circulating online. Someone's leaking them." Anthony's jaw clenched. "Who?" Marcus shook his head. "No idea yet, but it's bad. People are calling for a boycott, demanding answers. Some of our major clients are already asking questions." The SUV pulled up to Anthony's hotel, but neither man moved to get out. The air inside the car was thick with tension as they both grappled with the enormity of the situation. Finally, Anthony broke the silence. "We need to find out who's behind the leaks and why. This isn't just about accountability anymore, it's sabotage." Meanwhile, Megan sat in her small apartment, her laptop open to Carla's article. Her name wasn't mentioned explicitly, but she knew she was at the center of the storm. As she scrolled through the leaked emails, her heart sank further. The jokes, the comments, it all painted a picture she didn't want to be part of. For the first time, Megan began to wonder if her actions at the terminal weren't just a mistake, but a reflection of a culture she had unknowingly contributed to. Her phone buzzed with a message from a former colleague, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. "You seeing all this?" it read. "They're making you the face of it. Be careful." Megan's hands shook as she typed a reply, but she deleted it before sending. What could she even say? She wasn't innocent, but she also wasn't the mastermind behind the leaked emails or the systemic issues at Ascendaro. Yet, she feared becoming the scapegoat. Back at Ascendaro's headquarters, Sophia was piecing together a timeline of the leaks, trying to trace them back to their source. What she found left her stunned. The emails had been released by someone inside the company, a mid-level manager who had recently been let go for underperformance. It was an act of revenge, a calculated attempt to drag the company down with them. But as Sophia dug deeper, she realized something even more troubling. The manager hadn't acted alone. There was evidence of coordination with an outside group, one that was using the controversy to push its own agenda. Sophia immediately called Anthony. "I've got news," she said, her voice urgent. "The leaks, they're coming from someone we fired last month. But there's more. They've been working with an activist group to expose internal issues, and they're planning a press conference tomorrow." Anthony rubbed his temple, feeling the weight of the situation growing heavier by the minute. What's their angle? "They're framing it as a fight for transparency and accountability," Sophia explained. "But it's clear they're targeting you personally. They're claiming you knew about these biases and turned a blind eye." Anthony's chest tightened. He had spent his career fighting for equality, striving to build a company that reflected his values. The idea that he would ignore such issues was not only false but deeply insulting. Still, perception was powerful, and if the public believed the accusations, his credibility could be irreparably damaged. As the clock ticked toward the next morning, the tension escalated on all fronts. Anthony was preparing for the investor meeting, but now he also had to strategize for the press conference. Megan, grappling with her role in the controversy, was torn between staying silent and speaking out. And Sophia was racing against time to uncover more details about the activist group's motives. The stakes had never been higher, and the path forward was anything but clear. Each decision carried enormous risk, and the margin for error had all but disappeared. The question now was not just how Anthony would navigate the crisis, but whether the truths it revealed would ultimately strengthen him, or bring everything he had built crashing down. The morning of the press conference arrived with a storm of media attention. Cameras flashed, reporters crowded the steps of the building where the activist group had gathered, and hashtags tied to the controversy were trending across platforms. Inside, Anthony sat in a private room with Marcus, Sophia, and a small team of trusted advisors. They had spent the night preparing, crafting statements, and deciding on their approach. But the tension was palpable. Sophia paced the room, phone in hand. "The activist group is starting their press briefing," she said, glancing at the live stream. "They're painting you as complicit, saying you ignored the culture within Ascendero." Anthony nodded, his face calm but focused. "Let them talk. We respond on our terms." Outside, the leader of the activist group, a sharp, articulate spokesperson, stood at the podium. They detailed the emails, the allegations of bias, and the broader issues of systemic discrimination. Their words were cutting, and their audience seemed captivated. But as the leader continued, the tone shifted. They began to call for specific actions: a complete restructuring of Ascendero, the removal of senior leadership, including Anthony, and financial reparations for affected employees. Watching the stream, Sophia frowned. This isn't just about accountability anymore. They're pushing an agenda. Anthony leaned forward, studying the screen. He had seen this play before, genuine calls for justice being co-opted by individuals with ulterior motives. It was frustrating but not surprising. "We stick to the facts," he said. "The truth is on our side." Minutes later, Anthony stepped into the main hall, where dozens of reporters waited. He approached the podium with measured steps, his posture straight and commanding. The room quieted as he adjusted the microphone, his deep voice cutting through the silence. "Good morning," he began, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "Before I address the allegations, I want to make one thing clear. I take full responsibility for the culture within Ascendero. As its founder, the company reflects my vision, and when that vision is compromised, it's my job to fix it." The reporters leaned in, pens poised, as Anthony continued. He didn't shy away from the issues raised by the activist group. Instead, he acknowledged them directly, outlining the steps he was taking to address them: mandatory bias training for all employees, an independent audit of company practices, and a new advisory board to oversee diversity and inclusion initiatives. But then he shifted gears. "I'd also want to address the leaks and the narrative that has been built around them," he said, his tone steady. "Transparency is vital, but so is integrity. The emails that were leaked represent a failure, yes, but they do not define this company. And I will not allow this moment to be exploited by those with ulterior motives." Sophia stepped forward, handing Anthony a folder. He opened it and revealed a series of documents to the reporters, detailing the former manager's role in the leaks and their coordination with the activist group. The room erupted in murmurs as Anthony presented evidence showing how the leaks were part of a broader plan to discredit him personally. "This isn't about change," Anthony said, his voice firm. "It's about power, and I will not stand by while my reputation, my work, and the employees who make this company great are dragged through the mud." The final twist came when Anthony invited Megan to speak. The decision had been risky, but he believed in her willingness to take accountability. As she stepped up to the podium, her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was clear. She spoke candidly about her actions at the terminal, acknowledging her mistakes and the biases she had failed to confront. but she also revealed something unexpected. She had been the one to tip off Anthony about the activist group's deeper plans. "I saw what was happening," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "And I knew I had to make it right. Mr. Walker gave me a second chance, and I used it to uncover the truth." The room was silent as Megan finished speaking, her vulnerability disarming even the most skeptical reporters. Anthony stepped back to the microphone, delivering his closing remarks with the weight of someone who had faced the storm and emerged stronger. "Today isn't the end of this story," he said. "It's the beginning of a new chapter, one where we learn, grow, and lead by example. This company was built to break barriers, and that mission hasn't changed." As Anthony walked off the stage, the reporters shouted questions, their voices blending into a chaotic hum. But he didn't stop. He had done what he came to do, and now it was time to get back to work. In the days that followed, the narrative shifted. While the controversy had exposed flaws within Ascend Arrow, it also highlighted Anthony's resilience and commitment to change. His transparency and decisive action won over critics, and the company began to rebuild its reputation. Megan became an unlikely ally, using her story to advocate for better workplace practices, and Sophia's relentless efforts ensured that Ascend Arrow emerged not just intact but stronger. For Anthony, the experience was a reminder that success alone wasn't enough to shield him from challenges, or to guarantee the vision he had worked so hard to create. But it also reaffirmed his belief in the power of perseverance, accountability, and the courage to face the truth head-on.